Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's panel. My name is Tommaso Nodari, and I'm the Brussels representative of Civil Rights Defenders. We are a Swedish NGO that works on civil and political rights in different parts of the world, including in Latin America, mostly supporting civil society organizations and human rights defenders. And I've been invited by Human Rights Watch today to moderate this panel, in which I have the pleasure to have at the end of the table Heide Castillo, who as is defined in her biography, is a feminist, environmentalist, academic, and human rights defender. She's among the people who, unfortunately, in February 2023, were stripped of their nationality by the Ortega government. And she's currently a member of the coordinating committee of the dialogue space. In the middle of the panel, we have Juanita Goebertus Estrada, who's the director of Human Rights Watch's Americas division. And for the past few years, she was also a congresswoman in Colombia, who dedicated her term in particular to the implementation of the peace agreements with the FARC. And last but definitely not least, next to me is Felix Maradiaga, who is an academic, human rights defender, and former political prisoner from Nicaragua. He was actually released only a few months ago after almost 2 years of imprisonment, together with other 221 political prisoners. So these are our panelists. I was asked to give a little introduction, which I think is an ambitious task, to speak in 3-4 minutes about everything that has happened in Nicaragua up to now. But so to sum it up, after a turbulent 20th century, Daniel Ortega came back to power in 2006. And even though there was in place a ban on being president twice in a row and more than twice in total, he decided to stay. And so he ran again in 2011 and started his third mandate, among strong allegations of electoral fraud. Another election in 2016, with quotation marks around the words election becoming stronger, kept him in power. And on we get to 2023, when he is still in power. The human rights situation in Nicaragua has significantly deteriorated over these 15 plus years of the Ortega rule. The human rights crisis definitely escalated with the brutal crackdown on protesters in April 2018, and since has continued to deteriorate further. Just in May this year, over 60 people were arbitrarily detained, according to local human rights organizations. In early February, the government stripped 317 people of their nationality, including 222 political prisoners, which were expelled to the US, and confiscated their assets. Some of these decisions had an impact also on 2 of our panelists, as I mentioned. Many were left stateless as a consequence of this decision. The government has also dramatically restricted civic space, including by canceling the legal status of over 3,500 NGOs, applying repressive legislation since that infamous 2018. Among the groups that were stripped of their legal registration are not only groups that could be seen as controversial, but also dozens of humanitarian organizations, which played a critically important role in ensuring access to health services, water, and food for low-income and mostly rural communities. The international response to the crisis in Nicaragua, which is what we are going to speak about today, has been lackluster and uncoordinated. In particular, since we're here on the margins of the EU CELAC forum, which is about to start in a few moments, thinking of the European Union, EU Ambassador Bettina Muschheit was expelled in late 2022 after the EU had called on Ortega to restore democracy. This came as a shock to the European Union. And this year, in April 2023, Nicaragua said it would not receive the newly appointed ambassador-designate, Fernando Ponce. So the situation remains very tense, but this also means that the European Union is more cautious now in raising concerns about the situation in Nicaragua, because it wants to at least have a seat at the table, let's say. And I'm just describing it, not expressing a judgment on it. No one, unfortunately, ultimately has been held accountable for the serious human rights violations committed in 2018, which left over 350 people dead. No international monitoring bodies have been allowed to enter the country since, when authorities expelled the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, its special monitoring mechanism for Nicaragua, the appointed interdisciplinary group of independent experts, and the OHCHR itself. In a letter released on 17th of July, which is today, dozens of Nicaraguan victims and over 20 human rights organizations call on Latin American leaders and the EU and its member states to establish a regional group of friends for the Nicaraguan people, made up of governments across the political spectrum, to contribute to a transition towards democracy. And I'm sure we'll hear more about this project in particular from Juanita. So, on the margins of this EU CELAC summit that is starting today, we're here to discuss the current human rights situation and the role of the international community to effectively address the human rights crisis. I will be asking a few questions to each panelist, and then there will be time also for questions from the crowd. So, my first question is to Heide Castillo. So, human rights groups, UN experts, and foreign governments indicate that there is a serious human rights crisis in Nicaragua. What conditions allowed the crisis to reach this point? What can you tell us about the current context, Mrs. Castillo?
Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos, a todas. Primero quiero decir, antes de contestar la pregunta, que me siento muy contenta de estar aquí con Félix, un gran compañero, y me emociono porque nos habíamos visto cuando Félix regresó a Nicaragua después de que los dos estuvimos en el exilio. Y hasta hoy, después de estar preso, lo he podido abrazar de nuevo.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, before answering the question, I would like to say that I am extremely happy to be here with you all. And I am very, very happy to be here next to Felix, whom I hadn't seen in a long time. And it is a very dear colleague of mine. And after the exile and after him being in prison, I've been able to hug him again for the first time.
Sobre el contexto de Nicaragua, ya Tomás hizo un resumen muy importante y solo voy a complementar algunas ideas. Como defensora de derechos humanos, puedo caracterizar que Nicaragua vive uno de los peores momentos de su historia. Que su país, nuestro pueblo, vive en un estado de excepción de facto, en donde se impone un estado total de terror. En Nicaragua hay 4 opciones en este momento. Una, o estás con el régimen, y si no estás con el régimen, te quedan 3 opciones. O te matan, como le ha sido la historia de más de 300 de 2018 a la fecha, o te apresan, como nos ha pasado aquí a nosotros, o nos destierran forzosamente, como también nos ha pasado, y aquí hay un testimonio, pues, el caso de Félix y el mío.
So after the overview that Thomas has given you, I wanted to add a couple of ideas that are very important from the side of a human rights defender. Nicaragua is experiencing the worst time in history. Our country and our people are living in exceptional times. We are living in the midst of a terror state that is imposed by someone. In Nicaragua, you have 4 options. You are either with the regime, and if you are against it, then you only have 3 options. You are either killed, as we have seen with more than 300 people since 2018 up to now, or you are imprisoned, as Felix and I have experienced, or you are expelled from the country, as we have also experienced.
De manera que estamos hablando de una guerra. A veces pareciera que hay guerra solo en Ucrania por la invasión de Rusia, pero yo podría decir que en Nicaragua hay una guerra de una dictadura militar contra un pueblo completamente desarmado. Estamos ante una estrategia de aniquilamiento del pueblo que se opone a vivir como súbditos o como esclavos de un régimen que prácticamente ha llevado a Nicaragua a un retroceso histórico donde la ley y el Estado son ellos, la dictadura.
This is a war. We are experiencing war, and war isn't only in Ukraine because the Russians are invading Ukraine. No, our country, Nicaragua, is at war. We are at war against a military dictatorship that is going against the disarmed population. So our people, our citizens are suffering because, and they are being killed because they don't want to be the slaves of this regime, a regime that is the law and the state.
Y finalmente, porque hablaríamos meses y años de esta historia tan cruel, puedo decir que en Nicaragua se aniquiló el periodismo independiente, se aniquiló a la sociedad civil organizada, no existe libertad religiosa porque hasta rezar ahora es un pecado. La empresa privada inicia ahora un camino del que ya nosotros, la sociedad civil, ya venimos también de proceso de aniquilamiento. Se asaltaron las universidades, se ha borrado el expediente académico de los jóvenes que participaron en la rebelión y han sido expulsados al exilio. Y finalmente decirles 3 cosas. En Nicaragua hemos pasado por las celdas de la dictadura más de 2090 personas, entre hombres, mujeres trans, pero ahorita permanecen en la cárcel 64 personas, entre ellas Monseñor Rolando Álvarez, Marvin Vargas, que fue el primer preso político que ya tiene más de 10 años, mucho antes de 2018, y los presos del 19 de julio, porque el terrorismo no empezó en 2018. Habemos 317 desterrados que creían que eso había quedado en la historia en los tiempos de los nazis, pero en realidad la historia se está repitiendo. Y en la costa Caribe, la semana antepasada, han asesinado a 2 defensores de la tierra y guardabosques, y esta es una práctica cotidiana en ese territorio. De manera que podemos decir, yo tomaría la palabra de lo que dijo el grupo de expertos de derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas, Daniel Ortega y Rosario Murillo, funcionarios de agencia y estructuras del régimen, han cometido y siguen cometiendo graves sistemáticas violaciones, abusos a los derechos humanos y crímenes de lesa humanidad contra nuestro pueblo. Gracias.
And to finish, and this is not a cool story, I wanted to say that in Nicaragua, we don't have freedom of journalism. We don't have CSOs. We don't have freedom of religion because praying now is a sin. Private companies now are experiencing what we have been experiencing in the past. Universities have been assaulted. Academic records have been eliminated from those students who are opposed to the regime. So they have had to get out. More than 2,090 people have suffered, have been killed since the regime has been installed. Men, women, trans people. 64 people are right now in prison. Among them, Monsignor Roland Alvarez and also Bernice Vargas, who has been in prison for more than 10 years now. And with them, all the prisoners from the 19th of July. I want to say something and I want to refer. I also want to say that more than 312 people have been expelled from the country. And we would think that this is some history, something that Nazis would do in the past. But this is our present right now. And in the coast of the Caribbean, 2 people have been killed only a couple of days ago. They were people who defended the territories. People are continuously being killed. And I wanted to refer to something that the expert group on human rights from the United Nations said. Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo are systematically committing violations. They are not respecting human rights and they continue with the crimes against humanity. I could continue for many, many hours and months, but this is all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Castillo, for this summary. I found particularly striking the way you present the 4 options that every Nicaraguan citizen finds in front of themselves. My second question is for Felix Maradiaga. So on February 9th this year, you were released along with 221 other Nicaraguans after almost 2 years in prison, in the El Chipote prison. As someone who has suffered so much repression firsthand, could you describe what life is inside Nicaragua for someone who disagrees and criticizes the regime?
First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to highlight the situation of Nicaragua. With your permission, I will just say for a couple of minutes a few words in Spanish for those following back in Nicaragua. Hemos estado acá en Europa, no solo con el propósito de denunciar, hemos tenido voces muy valientes que quiero agradecer a la diáspora nicaragüense en Europa por no cesar en ningún momento en contar la tragedia del pueblo de Nicaragua, agradecerle a las defensoras y defensores de derechos humanos como Aide y muchas otras personas que durante nuestros casi 2 años de cárcel acompañaron, por ejemplo, a mi esposa Berta Valle y a la esposa de otro preso político de Juan Sebastián, la señora Vicky Cárdenas, en la denuncia. Así que no voy a entrar tanto en el detalle de la denuncia, sino quiero hacer rápidamente un resumen de los 7 puntos concretos que estamos trayendo como oposición organizada, como resistencia no violenta contra la dictadura de Ortega. En primer lugar, nosotros queremos señalar que la Unión Europea sigue siendo un faro de luz de esperanza para el mundo en los valores occidentales de los derechos humanos, de la dignidad de la persona humana, y los problemas geopolíticos no pueden desplazar esos valores. Comprendemos que hay una tensión global, en el caso concreto con China, y pareciera ser que China es el elefante blanco en la reunión. Hemos conversado por reuniones privadas en donde hay una prisa de Europa que ha despertado a la realidad que China está muy avanzada en su proceso en la región, capturando los minerales estratégicos y por tanto Europa parece despertarse a esta realidad y quiere competir comercialmente como debería hacerlo, pero la forma de hacerlo es con los valores de los derechos humanos. No se puede intercambiar, como lo hemos dicho en las reuniones bilaterales, los intereses comerciales por los derechos humanos. En segundo lugar, estamos pidiendo que se insista en una visita de alto nivel a Nicaragua para los presos políticos. El caso de Monseñor Rolando Álvarez nos preocupa gravemente, es el obispo de mi propia diócesis de Matagalpa, pero también hay otros presos políticos y hay además de todo esto, una gran cantidad de nicaragüenses que están en una situación grave, que se les hace firmar todos los días en la estación policial. Básicamente están en una situación de arresto domiciliar. En tercer lugar, nosotros creemos que es fundamental atender la grave situación de los exiliados que están dispersos por distintas ciudades y países del mundo en una situación de vulnerabilidad, y estamos solicitando que la Unión Europea pueda prestar un proceso acelerado, ya sea de refugio o de asilo, para estos nicaragüenses que están en un limbo jurídico en muchas ciudades europeas. Queremos agregar ese punto a la situación especial de las mujeres y de los jóvenes cuyas notas universitarias le fueron borradas completamente de sus archivos. Es decir, aunque quisieran acceder al sistema educativo, no hay registro de ellos. Entonces, estamos hablando de decenas de miles de jóvenes nicaragüenses que están por el mundo y no pueden ni siquiera acceder al sistema educativo. Y estamos pidiendo que la Unión Europea establezca un mecanismo especial para atender a los jóvenes. Eh, También para nosotros es fundamental que se apoye la iniciativa que ha tenido Human Rights Watch. Yo creo que en eso hablaremos después, pero creemos que es una iniciativa, amigos de Nicaragua, fundamental. Además de eso, creemos, como otro punto importantísimo, cortar los canales de financiamiento de la dictadura. Es inaceptable, para dar un ejemplo particular, que Nicaragua recibe casi el 30% de la ayuda al desarrollo que otorga el Banco Centroamericano de Integración Económica, donde hay fondos europeos destinados también al Banco Centroamericano. Básicamente son los puntos esenciales que tenemos. Hay otros, pero quiero ser respetuoso del tiempo. So back directly to your question, um, I will use my personal experience simply to say that the suffering that I went through is not something unique in Nicaragua, unfortunately. I went through a process that not human beings should go, but Nicaragua has turned into a huge prison. So even those who work within the government and do not agree with the government, they are monitored every single day. Their phones are looked at it. Um, Family members sometimes do not trust even their neighbors or the other family members because uh, um, people are pressured to um, look at what the other person is doing in something so simple as praying at home, for example. And I use the example of Miss Olesia Munoz, who had been already in prison in 2018, and she disobeyed a direct state order of not participating in a public religious activity. And she decided to sing at her church, at a public event of her Catholic church, and she was arrested once again for the second time. So Olesia Munoz is another political prisoner. I'm using those concrete examples just to illustrate how serious the situation is. And as I said in my introduction in Spanish, we are asking the European Union to keep their high standards of human rights. We understand that the China issue in their increasing presence in Latin America has pushed the European Union to talk particularly on commercial issues. And we understand that from a pragmatic level, but it's fundamental that human rights uh, uh, keep to be at the core of this process. And we have provided a number of key actions, a high level visit to Nicaragua, the importance of providing support to asylum seekers in Europe, the importance of attending the situation of women and young students who do not have access to the educational system in Europe, among other points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maradiaga. And yeah, the situation that both of you describe is extremely concerning, maybe even terrifying. Um, Juanita, could you give us an overview of what the international response to the crisis has been so far, in your opinion, particularly in Europe and in Latin America, since we are here on the margins of this forum?
Thank you, Tomaso, first of all, for helping us in moderate this space. Thank you, everyone, for being here today with us, and of course, most importantly, Aide, gracias. Felix, thank you so much for being here. This is really about sharing your testimony, your life experience at this summit side event. There's been at least three types of reaction from the international community regarding Nicaragua. First has been sanctions, a way of putting pressure, particularly through targeted sanctions, to try to put pressure in the Nicaraguan regime, the Ortega regime. In the case of the US, we've seen mechanisms of asset blocking, some of them individual. At least 46 people have been the target of asset blocking. In the case of entities, 12 entities directly targeted by the US administration, and of course, more than 800 visas that have been restricted to individuals in Nicaragua. We're speaking about targets that include, of course, Rosario Murillo, the sons of the presidential partners, government officials, the national security advisor, members of the military that have been the object of these kinds of sanctions. We've seen also sanctions from Canada, from the UK, from Switzerland, and from the European Union. In the case of the European Union, at least 21 individual sanctions and 3 sanctions to different entities. So one side of things, and we can go in the next block as to how efficient that has been, but one certainly way of reacting from the international community has been through sanctions. Then you have a second type of reaction, which is just public condemnation. It's difficult, I think, to find an issue that creates more consensus, if we can call it like that, even among governments that come from the left of the political spectrum in Latin America. There's increasing consensus in having public condemnation towards what happens in Nicaragua, particularly in multilateral spaces as the OAS. It's been constant condemnation of what happens in Nicaragua. Again, we can go more into the discussion, but one of the challenges has been that the OAS, through Almagro's leadership, has become less and less effective because the way it's seen as many governments in Latin America as politically partialized. But in general terms, you see constant resolutions from the OAS condemning what happens in Nicaragua. In the case of the UN Human Rights Council, and Aide was already mentioning, but it's been key the way in which the creation of the group of human rights experts was a way of being able not only to publicly condemn, but go from that into a mechanism of actually identifying the kinds of human rights violations and actually calling them, as Aide was saying, as crimes against humanity. And then it's precisely that we would call the third mechanism of putting external pressure by the international community. As we all know, Nicaragua is not a party to the ICC, but having this group of experts that just recently released its report identifying concretely crimes related to imprisonment, to murder, cases of torture, sexual violence, forced deportation, and political persecution has rendered a level of legal certainty and independence to be able to pinpoint what all of the victims had already denounced in many ways, but you could actually now have a full account of these kinds of crimes from April 2018. These have been mechanisms that have not been coordinated. They have been mechanisms in which you don't find concrete sequencing. There hasn't been a way of articulating those external pressures with a broader strategy that allows some kind of alternation between external pressure and concrete potential of either negotiations or bilateral conversations or diplomatic conversations to be able to create specific results in terms of bettering the human rights situation. So one of the ideas that we would want to share in the next block of questions is how is it that we use these kinds of external mechanisms that have been there, that the international community has used to be able to actually promote a transition to democracy in Nicaragua. So just to say, the international community has been there, has been aware, has used a lot of its tools, but so far we haven't been able to see that those tools, those mechanisms transit into concrete results for creating at least a space to promote democracy and a transit and a transition to democracy in Nicaragua.
Thank you very much for outlining that. So there are several mechanisms that have been used: sanctions, public condemnation, institutional condemnation, and other forms of external pressure. But that there's more to do for what concerns coordination and making sure that all these mechanisms are used to reach the maximum of the possible effect. My next question is again for Mrs. Castillo. So generally, in these types of situations, we can see that there are differences and at times tensions between human rights defenders who are in the diaspora and human rights defenders who remain on the ground. Could you tell us about your experience as someone who is exiled in the United States, in Louisiana, if I'm not mistaken? How would you describe the relationship between those of you who are abroad and those of you who are still in the country?
Sí, muchas gracias. Esa es una pregunta muy importante en el momento que estamos viviendo y por la historia del pueblo nicaragüense. Primero debo decir de que nadie escoge vivir en el exilio. Somos empujados por esa realidad y siempre digo que es como cuando agarras un árbol, en dependencia de la edad que tiene también, de un día para otro y lo arrancas y te lo llevas a un lugar lejano que probablemente tiene mucho o muy poco en común con tus hábitos, costumbres, tu lengua, pero lo que más duele es el rompimiento de tu tejido social, de tu tejido familiar, porque si hay algo que no podemos olvidar es que además de defensores y defensoras, también somos personas y tenemos sentimientos.
So thank you for this very important question. Right now, I wanted to say that we never choose to live in exile, right? We have to live because we are forced to do so. And I'm going to give you an example. Imagine that you take a tree and you put it out of the ground and you bring it very, very far away, independently of the age of the tree. This tree will suffer as we do because we have different customs, we have a different language, and it hurts. It hurts because your social and family tissue is broken, and that is what hurts the most. We must not forget that we are human rights defenders, but first and foremost, we are people, people with feelings.
Luego, explicarles que la historia de Nicaragua en casi 200 años ha sido una historia en donde el pueblo de Nicaragua, que somos tan rebeldes y que no nos gusta ser esclavos de nadie, siempre que el pueblo se ha levantado, ha sufrido traiciones, pactos, componendas entre las élites y los grupos políticos. Y eso ha generado en nuestra cultura, en nuestra sociedad, muchísima desconfianza entre unos y otros. Pero en este momento quiero decir que confío en que vamos a dar ese salto para vernos más complementarios. Este monstruo, como dijo la canción, es grande y pisa fuerte. Y estamos convencidos que uniendo esa fuerza de los que están adentro resistiendo con los que estamos en el exilio y la diáspora, en una mesa que le estamos proponiendo que se llame Todos somos Nicaragua. Para sentarnos, platicar, unirnos en la diferencia. No tenemos que pensar todos igual y de mandar una voz de aliento al pueblo de Nicaragua para decirle, es el pueblo de Nicaragua el que va a decidir cómo quiere que sea la nueva Nicaragua. Y para eso estamos proponiendo un proyecto político para la transición democrática que lo venimos construyendo participativamente por mucho tiempo. Tenemos una propuesta de cómo vamos a superar la crisis una vez que salga la dictadura. Nosotros le llamamos cómo vamos a enfrentar la crisis el día después que se vayan y demostrar que vamos a hacer las transformaciones necesarias para que Nicaragua por primera vez pueda elegir un gobierno por su voluntad, no impuesto, y que podamos conocer esa paz que nunca hemos conocido. Estamos en ese camino y yo sé que lo vamos a lograr.
I cannot explain 200 years of history, but I want to say that the Nicaraguan people are rebels. We don't like being slaves. And we have always, or every time that the people have risen up, have protested, we have been victims of treasons and pacts between the political parties and the elites. So we don't tend to trust each other. But I want to say that now I have the confidence and the trust that if we jump and if we commit to complement each other, we will be able to fight this. We are a monster with big feet. And if we unite those who are in the country and those who are outside in the diaspora or the exile around one table that we are going to call all our Nicaraguan people, we will be able to talk, we will be able to get to the same objectives, even though we don't have the same way of thinking. Of course, we know that only this way we will be able to get the Nicaraguan people to choose the government for once. We have a project for the democratic transition, and our proposal is already there to overcome the crisis that, of course, will be present the day after they have left. Right now, we want a change for the Nicaraguan people. We want them to choose for the first time their government. And that way, and only that way, we'll be able to know peace, peace that we have never experienced before. We are working on it, and I am determined to make it work.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Castillo. This was very powerful, and I wish that those who are listening, even online, from the diaspora or in the country, who maybe will feel demotivated for some reason, really hear your call and your underlining of how complementarity and working together for a common project is important. Mr. Maradiaga, although the Venezuelan crisis is very different from the situation in Nicaragua, we could draw lessons of what actions from the international community have worked and which haven't. As a political figure and as a prominent opposition leader, how do you envision a path forward for Nicaragua? What role should the international community play, and what can be learned from the so far failed efforts in Nicaragua? In Venezuela.
I think that although Venezuela and Nicaragua are both dictatorships, there are fundamental differences. Venezuela, of course, is a global producer of oil, and that makes a huge difference for Nicaragua. Nicaragua is amongst the poorest countries in the hemisphere. It's fully dependent of remittances. So about 27% of our GDP comes from Nicaraguans abroad. And that makes a fundamental difference. But going directly to your question on some of the issues that I think need to be revisited and apply to both cases are international standards in terms of human rights. I think that we have seen that the international community clearly is not prepared to deal with what I will call dictatorships 2.0. Um, After the Second World War, and I don't mean to sound academic over here, there's an infrastructure of international treaties that were designed under a fundamental premise that states will comply and that will try to be parts of a club. If I use that analogy, let's use the example of the OAS. If you look at the democratic charter, it basically assumes that member states would like to be within the OAS. However, when this charter was placed, no one thought about China, for example, coming to Latin America and saying, forget about the World Bank, forget about the EU, forget about uh, um, foreign aid for Nordic countries, for example. I can give you all the money, and you don't have to comply with human rights issues, with environmental standards. And I think the world was not prepared for that. We thought, using the phrase of our good friend Professor Francis Fukuyama, that it was the end of history. That after the fall of the Berlin Wall, these new and restored democracies that had gone through the third wave of democracy would actually comply with the treaties. But what happens when Maduro and Ortega actually laugh at the face of the international community? When they simply go into rigged elections and they do it over and over again, and they don't have real consequences of their actions. So I think that the first thing that we need to really tackle directly is that the international community must acknowledge that, I will use a phrase in Spanish, no tiene dientes. La comunidad internacional tiene que reconocer que no tiene suficiente dientes. So that's a very concerning issue. When you have a report from the United Nations Human Rights Council that clearly labels Ortega as someone who is a perpetrator of crimes against humanity, that is something that should really have direct implications. The second lesson learned is that these states, these tyrannies, should not try to play within the rules of free markets and be part of free trade agreements, such as the case of Nicaragua or Venezuela, that basically has plenty of countries willing to buy their oil with no real consequences. So we cannot have two tracks. We cannot have the track of the free markets and then the track of human rights going completely independent. That is something that is not only ineffective, but it's immoral. It's immoral that international companies, both European and Americans, continue to invest in these countries. And I will also add in that case the particular case of Cuba. I see many of my dear friends from Cuba investors from European nations going into Cuba when there are thousands of political prisoners in Cuba. So I can go into many lessons, but I want to be really respectful of time. But I think that in the case of Nicaragua, in the case of Venezuela and Cuba, since you asked me to look into similarities, I think that that's particularly concerning. But then the question is what to do. I provided some ideas in my introduction, but I think it's very important to support human rights defenders. It's very important to provide financial support to organizations at the grassroots, to provide a lifeline to organizations who are trying to empower civil society. And it's very important to hold accountable also the international private sector who has financial dealings. On a final note, the other aspect that I think is both closely related to Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and I will say, I will be very, very blunt on this. These are not governments. These are part of an international crime network, and they work as such. They are dealing with drugs. They are deeply connected to money laundering. They're arms dealers, and they participate in organizations such as the EU meetings. And we are having Diaz Canel just being received as a regular head of the states. What would everybody say if Pablo Escobar suddenly would have walked into an international meeting, 20 or 30 years ago? That is unacceptable. It's immoral. And we have to say that with all its letters. Quickly in Spanish, es inmoral que gente como Díaz-Canel y las dictaduras de Venezuela, Cuba y Nicaragua participen, a pesar de estar sancionados en estos espacios, sin ninguna consecuencias reales. Creo que la Unión Europea debe mantenerse alta en sus estándares de derechos humanos y reconocer de que estos no son regímenes, son parte de una mafia internacional. Gracias.
Thank you. Yeah, the international community has no dientes, but perhaps it's also because it doesn't want to use its teeth. I think it could have more teeth. And I think you've already highlighted areas such as trade, investments, and even just participation in international events in which it decided not to use teeth anyway. And the last question from me is for Mrs. Guebertus. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, over 180 Nicaraguan victims and 29 national, regional, and international human rights organizations having recently endorsed the initiative that was published today that seeks to strengthen international actions to address the crisis in Nicaragua. Calling on the democratic governments that are meeting today at the CELAC-EU summit to prioritize the situation in Nicaragua. Can you tell us a little bit more about this initiative and why this could be useful in the current moment of the Nicaraguan crisis?
Thank you, Tomas. So I think it's precisely because, as you were saying regarding Felix's comments, we believe the international community has and should use its teeth, and it should be able to harness a solution that is a proposal from Nicaraguans. As you were saying, it's more than 160 victims from Nicaragua who are making this proposal, 29 organizations, national and international, trying to say Nicaragua should not be a lost cause. Recently, a foreign affairs minister from the region sadly started a conversation on Nicaragua saying that it was a lost cause. It shouldn't. We should all be able to look for solutions. Our idea is that if you create a group of friends, you could have a coordinated strategy in which different actors with ideological diversity, this should be a group of heads of state that have plural views on how to solve the problems, both from Europe and from Latin America, that could collectively create a path for a serious negotiation that could revive momentum and be able to keep the agenda going on about the issues of Nicaragua, and that could identify potential elements of leverage so that Nicaragua and solving the issue of Nicaragua is actually important for Europe and for Latin America. And it ceases to be understood just as an issue of having Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela present at the summit, but without an agenda of how is it that we make sure that these three countries go back to democracy. There's issues like the credits from the Central American Development Bank, issues as universal jurisdiction, issues as how the pensions of the military from Nicaragua are traded internationally. There's issues about remittances that could be discussed strategically to be able to find a pathway towards democracy in Nicaragua. So this is just the start of an idea. We believe that the summit could just be the beginning of that conversation. But the bottom line is Nicaragua cannot continue to be a lost cause in Latin America. And we're ready to sum up our efforts to be able to contribute to that objective.
Thank you very much. I have a very brief follow-up question, actually. How can people help if they're hearing about this now and they haven't signed this letter? And how can people stay updated, like to see whether something happens of it and whether it's picked up?
Wonderful. So first of all, of course, anyone can join into this initiative in our Human Rights Watch webpage. You can join the possibility of becoming part of this idea of seeking for a group of friends for Nicaragua. Help us disperse this information, share it with your own contacts in trying to create this network. And most importantly, I think collectively look for these kinds of incentives as to how to make sure that both for Latin America and for Europe, it becomes important to solve the situation in Nicaragua and cease to just be something that we live with as if it was something that was admissible.
Thank you. Very clear. I think we could take 2 or 3 questions from the crowd. We're already running out of time, but I think it's always an important part of a conversation. I see a question from Camilo. I don't know if there's a mic.
Thank you. Camilo Tovar from Race and Equality. Well, I heard there's different, well, you talk about the different mechanisms that the international community have put forward to put pressure on the Nicaragua regime, and the fact that there has been lack of sequentiality and coordination. How could that sequentiality and coordination look better in the future? What can the international community do to make that look better? And related to that, is there any, if you see any possibility of using the universal jurisdiction mechanism, for example, in Spain or in Argentina, to put even more pressure on the Nicaragua regime?
Thank you. Let's take maybe a couple. Yeah.
Gracias a los tres por sus intervenciones, a Tomaso por la moderación. Soy Rafael Uzcategui de Venezuela y a mí me parece muy interesante la propuesta de Human Rights Watch de generar un grupo de amigos, de presidentes amigos diversos. Pero también me gustaría dejar la reflexión que ese grupo de amigos no solamente debería ser a nivel presidencial o de los gobiernos, sino también de las organizaciones sociales. Porque para mí como defensor de derechos humanos siempre es incomprensible cómo hay un doble estándar dentro de los movimientos sociales para la democracia y la vigencia de los derechos humanos, ¿no? Entonces, sentir en estos espacios como hay incomprensión, por decirlo elegantemente, sobre la situación de Cuba, Nicaragua y Venezuela es doloroso, cuando las organizaciones sociales deberían ser nuestros primeros aliados, y lamentablemente no lo son. Entonces, bueno, esto es una situación, yo creo que hay que desideologizar la lucha por los derechos humanos, sus principios que son universales para todos y todas, pero bueno, en el marco de las pasiones políticas se nos olvida. Pero bueno, cierro con la idea de que ese grupo de amigos también sea de la familia de organizaciones de movimientos sociales y grupos de derechos humanos para el caso de Nicaragua, pero también, por supuesto, se puede extender para otros países. Gracias.
Is it necessary that I summarize the question in English? No, doesn't matter. Okay. Is there anyone else? Otherwise, we can start answering these and then see. Yeah. Okay. Would you like to start, Mrs. Castillo, answering these questions?
Sí, esta propuesta que agradecemos muchísimo, quiero decir de que hace ya algunos años, en momentos de desesperación, habíamos propuesto la necesidad de conformar una comisión de alto nivel internacional para que trabajara en la transición democrática. Y por eso ahora que Human Rights lo hace de una manera pues ya más ordenada, organizada, más legitimada con todos estos procesos, nosotros lo vemos como una urgente necesidad, pero no quisiéramos más llamamientos, resoluciones, informes, que ya son muy importantes, porque yo debo reconocer que los organismos de derechos humanos nos han acompañado de una manera extraordinaria, pero quienes tienen la gran deuda con nuestros pueblos es ese multilateralismo que al parecer está siendo sobrepasado por las dictaduras. Al pueblo de Nicaragua le asombra que una dictadura que toma por asalto las oficinas de la Organización de Estados Americanos dentro de Nicaragua no tenga ninguna consecuencia para el régimen. Entonces, ante este desafío, pensamos que esta es una gran oportunidad que le damos los pueblos a Naciones Unidas, tanto al sistema universal como al sistema interamericano, para demostrar que no están siendo sobrepasados, porque muchas veces se quiere pedirle al crimen organizado que responda con buena voluntad a la diplomacia. Y mientras tanto, la sangre sigue corriendo. Y finalmente, quiero decir que la geopolítica no puede ser solo para el comercio, que ya es importante, genera riqueza, pero la geopolítica debe poner en el centro la estabilidad, la democracia, los derechos humanos y la paz duradera. Y cuando no hay coordinación, a nosotros se nos pide unidad a los pueblos. Y nosotros decimos, hagámoslo juntos. Mientras nosotros construimos la unidad en la diversidad, yo quiero ver a Naciones Unidas coordinando con la Organización de Estados Americanos, a los gobiernos de la Unión Europea, Canadá, Estados Unidos, con nuestros gobiernos latinoamericanos, diciendo, nos duele Nicaragua, encontremos una solución. Esa es la propuesta y por eso la respaldamos.
Many years ago, we already had this proposal. We wanted to create a high-level international commission for the democratic transition. But right now, we have Human Rights Watch, who has created this initiative that is more organized. And for us, this is now an urgent need. We don't want any more calls, no resolutions, no reports, even though they are very, very important for us. And the human rights organizations have accompanied us greatly. But right now, we have a debt, a multilateral debt. And our people is surprised because they have seen how this dictatorship has taken the OAS offices in Nicaragua without any consequences. Right now, we have an opportunity. And right now, we have to coordinate. We cannot expect from the organized crime to have a political will. No, we need to go further than business. So geopolitics is not only business, it's not only a market, even though we have to create and move money. Right now, we must ensure that we put peace, human rights, stability, and democracy at the core of our geopolitical efforts.
Thank you. Mr. Maradiaga, do you want to answer the questions? And please try to keep it short because we're running out of time.
Very quickly. So an action plan, going back to the coordination, it's important that the international community, and going back to your suggestion of Rafael from Venezuela, I fully agree. Also, international civil society, they should all agree on 5 key points, or 3 to 5. We see as well the need of, I would say, directly targeted sanctions. We have seen a reaction at some point from the European Union and the United States as well. But I think that when they coordinate their timing, is far more effective. Um, uh, Number two, it's important to work with national counterparts, and I take that opportunity to mention that recently, um, over 50 key national leaders of Nicaragua from a very diverse background were able to choose 5 speakers of the Nicaraguan opposition, la vocería colegiada de la oposición, through a process publicly known as Monteverde. Monteverde is not a new opposition movement. It's a process of internal dialogue of the opposition that was created when the main presidential candidates were arrested. So those who were in charge of the political movements, most of them traveled to Costa Rica and started a meeting in an area of the Costa Rican country known as Monteverde. And out of that, an internal dialogue process that is very plural started. And I have the pleasure to be among those 5 speakers of the Nicaraguan opposition. So I think that for coordination to be more effective, it has to have a matter of timing, a matter of plan of action, and a clear coordination with the national leadership of Nicaragua chosen by Nicaraguan organizations. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Gubertus?
Very briefly, because both Aide and Felix, think, have addressed the questions. But first of all, is that if you understand the external pressures to be precisely pressures towards being able to create a solution, and you see the experiences around the region and come to the conclusion that the idea that these dictatorships can just collapse is just untrue, then we're talking about understanding the pressures towards creating the pathway for a serious negotiation that can allow Nicaragua to transition from a dictatorship to a democracy. If that is the case, then both the negotiations of between May and June 2018, and then between February and April 2019, um, very much led by the Vatican, were insufficient in terms of understanding and coordinating the external pressures with the possibility of making concrete progresses in the democratic sphere. We today don't know enough of what happened behind the expulsion of 222 political prisoners and the way that they were expelled to the US, whether there was or not negotiations behind the scenes, and what exactly were the different possibilities in terms of concrete steps towards democracy. And those mechanisms should be much more transparent to be able to understand what kinds of pathways are towards that direction. And just very briefly on the universal jurisdiction, we do see that the report from the group of experts from the UN Human Rights Council is a specific framework to be able to process these crimes internationally in different jurisdictions that could create additional pressure for the potential, again, of a serious negotiating table. And I fully agree with Proea that this is about civil society organizations getting together and making sure that it doesn't matter whether the government is from the left or from the right, but we all together are united in condemning any of these kinds of human rights violations.
Thank you. And to wrap up, today we've heard a short summary of the many atrocities and of how, in addition to people who are in prison or people who are kicked out of the country itself is somewhat a prison for anyone who doesn't want to follow the minimum, like the guidelines that are imposed by the regime. HRDs and CSOs should be united in diversity, be them in diaspora or in the country. They should all work for the same objectives and efforts in a complementary way. The international community has indeed been active until now with various instruments, but it could do more, it has to do more, it has to have more teeth and be more coordinated. And last, we heard about one attempt to start this coordination, this friendship group, hoping that heads of state will join, and international organizations, NGOs, and those movements that were mentioned also in the questions can help make this proposal true. I would like to thank our speakers, Heide Castillo and Felix Maradiaga, for bringing their testimony from Nicaragua, and of course, Juanita Gobertus and Human Rights Watch as organizers of this event. And last, but definitely not least, the interpreter who has been doing a great work throughout this event. And thanks everyone for attending.